Welcome, everyone. We're very pleased to have Dr. Megan Moreno from the Seattle Children's Research Institute speak to us today on depression and social media, challenges and opportunities. Dr. Moreno, MD, MSc, D, MPH, is an associate professor of pediatrics at the University of Washington School of Medicine. She's principal investigator of the Social Media and Adolescent Health Research Team at Seattle Children's Research Institute. Dr. Moreno's training includes an MD from George Washington University, a master's in education from the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and a master's in public health from the University of Washington. Dr. Moreno's research interests focus on the intersection of technology and adolescent health. Dr. Moreno.
Well, thank you all so much for the opportunity to come and speak with you today. I'm really excited to share some of what we've learned about how adolescents are using technology to tell us about their health. So as you heard, my research team is the Social Media and Adolescent Health Research Team, SMART, or if you hail from the Boston area, SMART. And our mission is to advance society's understanding of the relationship between media and adolescent health towards a few goals, one of which educating adolescents and their families, both in our clinics and in the community, providing better health care for teens, and developing innovations in adolescent health care. And the work that we do really centers around three core areas. So we view our vision is to provide education to adolescents and families towards safe internet use. That's our internet safety core area of work. To develop tools to assess internet use and define problematic internet use. That's our measuring technology use and misuse core. And to both create and interpret messages within social media to promote healthy behaviors. And that's our social media and health core, where most of the work I'll be discussing today resides. So I know that I'm preaching to the choir here to talk about depression and adolescent and young adult health, which we in Adolescent Clinic have started calling AYA. We know that depression is one of the top 3 illnesses that cause morbidity and mortality in this population and is hugely consequential both in the health sense, the increased risk for substance use, suicide, comorbidities, including other mental illness, as well as the impact for many of these youth who are navigating the school and early work system. We see higher rates of dropout in school, lower academic success, and impaired relationships for adolescents. One of the challenges in adolescent and young adult health is that adolescents don't go to the doctor. They're one of the healthiest populations we have, and so they're one of the populations that's least likely to see a physician. And if they do go to the doctor, and I'm speaking here particularly about pediatricians, many adolescents are not asked about the major risks that affect their morbidity and mortality. So one study showed that less than half of teens who visit a pediatrician are screened for things like substance use and depression. So one of the things that's interested me for the last 10 years is whether social media can offer us some new opportunities to think about early identification, prevention, or intervention in these youth. And social media is a really exciting place to be thinking about adolescent health. I think it's something that started out as a very social tool and has really grown to pervade all these areas of our society that we didn't anticipate. So I'll show you, this is a sign that a friend of mine sent to me when he was traveling globally, and it's a sign in a hotel that warns in case of fire, you should leave the building before posting it on social media. So I think that gets at how ingrained it is and how many people's first reaction in a situation is to actually capture it rather than going through what maybe previously were normal reactions to it. I also recently attended a conference on social media that was hosted by a law enforcement agency, and they are using social media in really innovative ways to try to anticipate crime or possibly identify criminals. And this was one example that was shown to me from Twitter. I'll read the top one. It's a tweet from a young man who says, "Any dealers in the Vaughan area want to make a 20-sack chop? Come to this particular Mr. Lube. I need a spiff or two to help me last this open to close." And then the York Regional Police responds, "Awesome, can we come too?" So they're anticipating crime and reacting and letting people know that they're out there and paying attention. So I think this gets at some innovative ways that other organizations outside of healthcare are thinking about social media as a prevention or intervention tool. So if we come back to thinking about social media in the area of adolescent and young adult health and in the area of depression, if we consider the question I pose, can social media offer new opportunities for early identification, prevention, or intervention? I think there's a few questions we need to think through in order to get at that answer. And one would be, is depression present on social media? We know that depression can be considered a stigmatizing illness. Is this something that people are willing to disclose or talk about on social media? A second question being, are references to depression present on social media? Are those linked to actual depression symptoms, or are they linked to what my patients would call drama? Another question would be, how do other adolescents and young adults interpret these references if they see them? What are their views of them? And then last, thinking about, are adolescents and young adults willing to interact with us as providers and clinicians regarding depression on social media? So what I'd like to do is walk through some of the work that we've done on some of these questions to share with you. So is depression present on social media? I would say probably 5 or 6 years ago, this was a real question, but now there's probably few among us that haven't heard some story that gets at a patient or a niece or a nephew or a client and their impression or experience with seeing depression on social media. In one of our early studies we did probably about 6 years ago, we looked at Facebook profiles from 18-year-olds. We were really interested in this transition period of being 18, moving away from high school, possibly into college or a work environment. And we were interested in how adolescents this age represented their health on Facebook. And so as you can see, we looked at some of their health risk references, things such as substance use, and you can see the most common reference to health of the ones that we examined was references to alcohol. And this was a mostly college freshman, first year of college population, so it may not be surprising that this was something they represented on their Facebook profiles as part of who they were, who they were becoming at that time. Tobacco and drugs were also present. About a quarter of the profiles had one or more references to sex or sexual behaviors. And then we were also looking for some of the health conditions to get a sense of what sort of health conditions were acceptable to this population to portray on a Facebook profile. And you can see that depression symptoms were present on just over a quarter of the profiles, and references to ongoing or chronic illness were much more rare. I was very interested in whether diabetes or whether asthma or other chronic illnesses might be present on these profiles, but the few that we did see had to do more with expressing irritation with things like seasonal allergies or migraines, or endometriosis was one that came up a few times that surprised us. Yes?
Is this the static profile, not including the like status posts?
Oh, good question. In this study, we looked at 1 year of profile content. So we looked at status updates, we looked at photos, and we looked at it over a whole year. Great question. And you can see weight concerns was also there, but not hugely prevalent. And of that 6.4%, I'd say about half of those were references to concerns about being overweight, and about half were references to concerns about being underweight. So this study is one that I like to think about because it's one that really got us thinking about this idea of depression being present on social media. And we followed up this study with a more focused study trying to refine our own way of approaching depression symptom references and applying a more rigid clinical guideline to it. So this study I'm going to tell you about, we were looking for prevalence of references, we were looking for their associations with other Facebook variables, and we also wanted to try, because Facebook is time and date stamped and we can look over a long period of time, we wanted to try to identify whether there were any time periods in which a profile's disclosures would meet criteria for a major depressive episode in over a 2-week period. So I'll show you a little bit what we did. We did a content analysis approach. We did what I would call old-fashioned content analysis, which means with 2 eyes instead of with bots or spiders or crawlers. And we applied DSM criteria, or another way of looking at it is we applied the symptoms that are included in the PHQ-9 that we use in our clinics, and looked for disclosures in text that seemed synonymous with those depression symptoms. We also coded the responses from peers via comments on status updates. And then again, we looked across a year of profile content to see whether there was a 2-week period in which DSM criteria for a major depressive episode was present. So this is what our code book looked like. You can see down this, your left side are the symptoms that we measure in the PHQ-9. You can see we've taken those symptoms and added some keywords and some synonyms, some of the examples that we've seen on Facebook profiles that we felt would meet those criteria. And then for each of the criterions which have some wiggle room, we were very careful to try to identify areas in which we would not include a disclosure as a reference. So anything where somebody's talking about a single day experience, a bad day, a horrible day, those were things that we kept an eye out for and wanted to exclude, because we know that Facebook is a common place, and social media in general is a common place to vent about one bad day. So in general, things that had a single day reference were excluded. And then things that talked about going out and eating a bunch of junk food with your friends, which we know is a somewhat normative college experience from time to time, we tried to be careful about those and not evaluate those as though they were full appetite changes. So those are some of the examples of how we approach this. I will mention that when we started this study, we were really worried at the time about what would happen if we saw references that referred to self-harm, particularly references to suicide. And what we did at the time is we collaborated with the university health system where we were doing this study, and we developed a protocol so that if these references were present, we would have a partnership with them to be able to reach out to the youth that were displaying in that way. So that was a very helpful experience for us to think through our responsibilities, even if we're just basically social media stalkers. So as I mentioned, we also were very curious, not from a diagnostic standpoint, but more from a pattern recognition standpoint, to identify whether there were time periods on Facebook in which we saw criteria, disclosures that met the pattern of criteria for a major depressive episode. So that would be 5 of 9 symptoms over 2 weeks, with the required symptoms of depressed mood or loss of interest and pleasure. And again, I want to emphasize this was not with any thought that we were actually being diagnostic. It was more, can you recognize date and time stamp patterns that meet some of these criteria that we often use in clinics? So in this study, we looked at 200 profiles. These were college students. The average age was 20 years old, and they were roughly half male. And what we found is that, similar to our pilot study, about a quarter of the profiles referenced a depression symptom 1 or more times over the year period that we evaluated. So let me show you a little bit about what we found. I think one of the things that's been striking to our team is just the rich and contextual data we can get. So you see some examples up there of how people can display and disclose depression symptoms on Facebook. Question?
Sorry, you may have said this. Did these folks know that they might be stalked?
In our current studies, we always we approach participants and connect our profiles to them. This was an earlier study at the time when Facebook was mostly publicly available, and so in this particular study, they did not know. Great question. So I think that these examples get at how some participants will choose to use the word depressed, use the word depression. Some participants will tell us about their symptoms through using poetry and songs, and that's something that we see quite often, is poetry or songs or lyrics of some type. I think another thing that was interesting to us is looking at the peer response to these types of displays. And what we found actually is that receiving a response to a displayed depression symptom reference was associated with continuing to display in that manner over the course of the year that we evaluated. So for each additional response from a friend, a student would display twice as many depression references in the time subsequent to that. Now, these references were one of the more enjoyable and interesting findings that we had, and I'd like to show you a few of them. So here's an example. This is an 18-year-old young woman. She says, "Feeling so bad today, like nothing is going to get better." And the responses say, "Hang in there, baby, it will get better. I want to get coffee." And I think what's interesting about that is you see some general kind of supportive comments, but you also see the opportunity to interact in person. The 19-year-old male is one of my favorites. He uses some sort of song, lyric, or poem, like a knife to my heart, like a bullet to the chest, can't stop crying. And his friend says, "I'm coming over and I'm bringing the Xbox." To me, that is just therapy in a nutshell. His friend is on his way. And then the third one, this woman says, feel like I can't do anything right, sad and frustrated. And again, she has some of these general supportive comments. We're here for you. We love you. But again, someone saying, want us to take you out. So I think that this to us was very interesting because this isn't just a bunch of very passive clicking of likes. This is people writing personal comments and also offering to have some in-person engagement with someone that they're worried about. When we looked at these criteria applied to these profiles over the course of 1 year, again, there were 200 profiles and 5 of them had a 2-week period in which on Facebook they chose to display depression symptom references in a pattern consistent with major depressive episode. And what's interesting to me is if you look at those 5 profiles, you can learn a lot about the pattern of how they display. So if you look at this graph here, you can see for participant 1, this is back in July of 08, they have 1 or 2 references, then nothing, then it starts to escalate. It peaks here in October, November, and then it de-escalates, but there's still some references here. I think if you look at some of the folks over there, participant 5, there's really, oh great. If you look at participant 5, there aren't really references for the first part of our assessment, and then you see 6 references, 7, up to 10 references. So you see this escalation and de-escalation that suggests that these are not random events that they're disclosing in this way. So after that study, more recently, we know that a lot of our participants are doing what we would call dual use of both Facebook and Twitter. And we've been kind of joking that it seems as though many of our adolescents and young adults are building a social media portfolio, similar to a stock portfolio, where they're using multiple sites and using them in these tools in different ways. And so we're interested in how depression is being referenced on Twitter. And in this study, we used more big data techniques. We used a tool called Discover Text, which pulls tweets from Twitter. And we used search terms of depressed and depression during a single 7-day period in 2013. So 1 week only, pulling a subsample from Twitter. And what we found was in 1 week, the data collection tool pulled 297,000 tweets that referenced depression. And what was interesting to us is over 1,000 of them were favorited by someone. About 40% of them included a geolocation, which means that you knew where the person was who had tweeted that. And about 70% of them were from a mobile device, which makes sense because the culture of Twitter is much more mobile, much more on the move. Yeah.
Was this only individuals? Like I have on my Twitter feed, I have like treatment of depression. Would that have counted?
It would have. So organizations would have shown up in this as well, and we were interested in that. Great point.
Okay.
So when you look at what these tweets were, we collected a subsample of 1,000 to manually evaluate. And one of the things we were interested in is, are these tweets or retweets? And about 60% of them were retweets. So a lot of the content that's out there it's not original content. It's someone taking a tweet and retweeting it on behalf of themselves. And then when we look at the content, about 50% of them were individuals posting personal experiences with depression. About 20% of them were organizations either posting facts or research about depression. Only about 5% of them were posting tips or resources, and about 1% were news stories. So that was really interesting to us as well. This is a much different platform, a much different culture, where you're seeing people posting about their individual experiences, but there's also a lot of facts and organizations, although the provision of resources is pretty minimal in that big pool. We also used some suicide search terms within that larger sample just to see how many of those tweets also were hashtagged or referenced suicidal terms that would suggest concern for suicide. And so some of the terms we used is suicide without the E, so we could catch suicide and suicidal, the terms kill myself and the terms want to die. And so you can see out of that larger 290,000 sample, about 7,500 met those criteria for search terms. Now, I think it's important to point out that many people who post on Facebook and who tweet regarding depression never use any of these terms that we used. A lot of the patients that we've seen in clinic or some of the stories we've seen when people have posted on social media regarding suicide have often done so using none of these terms. So this is just the tip of the iceberg and people who are choosing to use these terms. So here's some examples of some of the tweets that met those criteria. One says, got depressed, told friends I hated them, went all hashtag suicidal. And another one of the tweets says, people make me want to kill myself forever, hashtag depressed. So those, again, they look pretty similar to some of the status updates I showed you from Facebook. So for people who are using this as a tool to be able to discuss how they're feeling, it looks pretty similar. So from these studies, one of the things we concluded were, despite the potential for stigma surrounding mental illness, about a quarter of Facebook profiles displayed references to depression, and depression and suicide references are present on Twitter. And again, I was struck by the small prevalence of resourced tweets. To me, that seems like an area that we haven't quite tapped yet, that we could be doing more to put more resource tweets out there. And I think it's also interesting to think about that depression diagnoses involve symptom patterns over time. That's what we do in clinic when we're monitoring patients. Is there a way that social media can provide an innovative way to identify adolescents at risk? Not to diagnose using Facebook, but identify teens who might benefit from coming into our clinics or undergoing a more formal evaluation. So for our second question, are depression symptoms, are depression references on social media linked to someone's own lived experience of depression? And to evaluate this one, we did a study looking at the association between displayed depression symptom references on Facebook and self-reported depression symptoms. In this study, we had two universities, University of Washington, University of Wisconsin. We should have had Wyoming, it would have been a trifecta, but we got that far. Our participants were 18 to 20 years old. We evaluated their Facebook profiles over 1 year for whether or not they had one or more depression symptom references. And then we sent all of the participants a link to take the PHQ-9. So what it looked like is, for example, if this half of the room, if you all had displayed one or more depression symptom references in the last year, you would be considered depression symptom displayers. And if you guys did not, you would be considered non-displayers. And then this whole room takes the PHQ-9, and we see, do your guys' PHQ-9s look different than yours? Pretty crude, but we had about 224 participants. The average age was about 18. Again, they were about half female. About 68% Caucasian, about half from our UW versus UW. And in this study, we had a little bit higher prevalence of displayed depression symptom references, a little bit higher prevalence of women compared to men, and we saw that first-year college students were more likely to display depression compared to the older years. So I'll show you this graph, and what you can see here is that the non-displayers, that's this half of the room is in gray, depression displayers, this half of the room is in dark gray, and again, this is displaying one or more references over the past year. So if you displayed 9 and you displayed once, we didn't distinguish between that, it's crude. And what you can see here is the categorization based on the PHQ score. So not at risk for depression, mild depression, moderate, and moderate to severe. And you can see here, you can see here the percentage of the profiles that fell into that display group. So for those that did not score at risk for depression, we see there's more non-displayers than displayers. And for each of the categories of the PHQ-9 that suggest depression, there's more displayers than non-displayers. There's a couple limitations here. You can tell we don't have a lot of participants in the severe category, so it's a little bit hard to really make statistical claims about that category. And what we found was, again, the mean PHQ-9 score for these two groups is still on the lower side. And we saw this trend that displayers were more likely to score into one of the depression categories compared to non-displayers. And the most statistically significant group was for the mild depression group. So for this study, what we thought, because it was such a stronger relationship for those who scored in the mild depression category, one of the things we thought is that these participants, these are college students, they may be using Facebook to express and potentially receive support for mild depression symptoms rather than a method to identify students at significant risk for severe depression. So now our third question, which was, how do adolescents and young adults interpret these displayed depression symptom references? If we're seeing them, certainly these adolescents who have Facebook friend groups of around 500 Facebook friends are probably seeing them as well. So we wanted to know, what is their experience? What are their thoughts when they see these types of references? And for this study, We again went at what do peers think when they see display depression references. We focused mostly on Facebook, and we recruited college student participants into focus groups, and we talked through how they use Facebook, how they interpret different types of peer disclosures, what have they seen, what have they done. And we had 34 participants in 7 focus groups. Most had seen a status update that they would consider a depression reference. And we had a few themes that emerged from our data. So one of the themes was that students' views of mental health status updates kind of fell along a continuum. They diverged from being considered either a very serious call for help or a need of support to people who thought that they were joking or seeking attention. This is not hugely surprising, I can imagine, and I'll show you a few example quotes. So one person says, it's like they don't feel comfortable enough to say it in person, but they really want someone to reach out to them. It's easier to talk about it on Facebook, where you're not directly complaining to someone, and then if someone wants to help you, they will. I thought this was a very insightful quote. Here's another person who says, well, it depends on the situation. Some people tend to be very dramatic. And this theme of drama comes up again and again when we talk to adolescents and young adults about Facebook. And this one's really interesting. This quote I'll read to you. I've never seen another one. We've never had another person say it in another group. But this person says, if people are open enough to post on Facebook, it doesn't seem as serious. If they were truly having a tough time, I don't know they would want everyone to know about it. So I think it's important to recognize there's some people out there that really see these and assume that because it's on a social media site, it's not as serious. And what was interesting, what came out through a lot of these discussions, is that people often viewed Facebook and how other people used it through the same lens that they viewed it and how they used it. So people who said, oh, you know, everybody's very dramatic would say, well, I use Facebook, you know, to kind of stir things up a little bit. Or people who said, well, I assume that if they put it on there, they're joking, would often say things like, well, I use Facebook to try to get my friends to laugh. So a lot of times people come to Facebook and assume that other people are using it in the same way that they are. A second thing came up is we talked a little bit about some of their perceptions of whether they take a comment at face value differently based on gender. And we were somewhat surprised to hear that from these participants' point of view, there were very few gender differences in how people display mental health status updates. And some of the quotations said things like, I think it's pretty similar, maybe a little more from girls, but it's more an individual thing, and I don't think you can really classify it by gender. It depends on the person. And the other person said, I've seen guys have depressing statuses, like indicating they're deeply depressed or distraught, but I've seen girls do that too. So from their perspective, this was something that was really distributed between both genders. And one of the most interesting themes for me was that participants over and over through these groups described that their own personal reactions or their planned action to mental health status updates really reflected their offline relationships. So here's a quote, if it was a close friend, I would definitely say something, but I know there are people that have all these friends on Facebook and talk to them maybe once a year. If they had something in their status update, I wouldn't really think anything of it because I don't really know them. So I think this gets at what we see a lot of in literature for decades, that if someone's in trouble and you know them, you're probably going to try to help. But if it's someone you don't know that well, you're probably going to assume that their closer friends are going to help. And so what we were interested in is that a lot of those offline relationship patterns really continue when someone's in the online environment. So what we concluded from this study was that peers commonly view these displayed references to depression, their interpretations of them vary, and their decisions about responding are really grounded in the strength or lack of strength of their offline relationship. And so finally, our fourth question was, are adolescents and young adults willing to interact with us as providers, adults, boring grown-ups regarding displayed depression symptoms on social media? For this study, we took a slightly different approach. We did individual interviews because we weren't sure if people would feel comfortable discussing it in a focus group. And in this study, we focused on first-year college students, in part because in our other studies we had seen this was a group that tended to have more displays. They did one-to-one interviews with a graduate student. The interviews were audio recorded, they were transcribed, And we asked questions about how they would want to be approached if a concerning status update was noticed on their Facebook that hinted at depression. And so we developed a coding scheme, we reviewed the transcripts, and we coded those responses into categories. So in this study, we had 60 participants. They were 18 and a half. They were a little more than half female. And what we found was a couple general categories I'll describe for you. The first category was that college students were very open to being approached by friends or by close peers, and they preferred the approach to be in person. So they talked about, if I posted on my profile that I'm feeling really depressed, I don't mind if my friends come up and talk to me about it and say, hey, how are you doing? But I don't really want them to comment. I don't really want them to message me. I want them to just come talk to me. The second group that they talked about was that they were a little less enthusiastic about being approached by professors or advisors, and they thought the approach should initially be via email. And a lot of clarifying comments were things like, you know, I really, really like this one professor I have, but I don't want him to come up to me after class and start talking to me in front of my friends. So they wanted that professor or advisor to send them an email and say, hey, why don't you come to office hours this week? I want to check in with you. And so for that group, they felt kind of more weird about it, but it was okay. And then the final group was university officials, administrators, anyone that was doing a big data approach and flagged them and tried to reach out to them they thought was way, 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 way creepy. And I think we had one transcript where the person said, just don't do that. So one thing that we thought was interesting is students talked about that they wanted their friends to approach them in a very straightforward manner. So they didn't want them to dance around the issue. They wanted them to be caring. And they talked about that it's very okay to say, I'm coming and talking to you because I'm worried about something you posted and I want to know how you're doing. So bringing up the post, it doesn't need to be a big secret. That some of our participants would say, well, why would I put it on Facebook if I wanted people to act all secretive about it? And they talked a lot about how what they want is questions. They don't want people to say, I saw that you are depressed, we are going to the counseling center. They don't want a judgment, they wanted questions. So they talked about questions like, how are you doing? Do you want to talk about anything? I saw your post, I wanted to know if you're doing okay. And that was pretty consistent through the interviews. So what we found is that adolescents and young adults were open to being approached in an inquisitive and caring manner by people they know. So we've talked through 4 different areas where we've done some work. We've done some work on whether depression symptoms are present on social media. I would say we found that that is the case. We've found that depression references have links to self-reported depression symptoms. We've found that interpretations by adolescents and young adults for those references vary. I showed you some great examples where adolescents and young adults really are responding supportively and making arrangements to meet with that person in person. But I also showed you some of the quotations where people view these references as drama and are not likely to take action. And we found that there are some ways that adolescents and young adults are willing to interact with us regarding these disclosures, but there's certain rules that we need to think about in doing so. So what we're doing right now is we're looking at more real-time depression symptom references and their association with self-report. And the way that we're doing this is we've partnered with some folks from UW who have a longitudinal data set in which they've taken depression, they've done depression interviews with participants at certain time points over the last 10 years. So then we've been able to connect to those participants and Facebook friend them and go back to the date at which they had that depression symptom interview and look at the time period around that to see if depression symptom references are present. I think that will really help us because as you saw in our previous study where we compared displayers and non-displayers, that was a pretty healthy population. And this population, we're excited to learn more because we can get more real time with around that time of disclosure. And it's also a population that's oversampled for depression. So I think that'll help us understand more about what this looks like for patients who have more severe symptoms. We also have a book that my team and I put together that is focused around internet safety in general, but we do have an entire chapter in it actually looking at mental health and depression symptoms and trying to coach parents through some of these discussions if parents are the ones who identify these types of symptoms with their own kids, or maybe not parents, what I've often found is that many teenagers have one cool aunt. Maybe some of you are the cool aunts out there who is Facebook friends with all the nieces and nephews and knows absolutely everything that's going on. And they kind of run interference between the kids and their parents. And so those folks, I think, are really interesting to think about as partners in this. So what can we think about as future possibilities? I think this is where us in healthcare are really thinking about the weight of this work. It doesn't mean a lot unless we could use it to reach out and help patients. And I think it's interesting to think about what's possible within social media. So interventions incorporating social media. One thought would be, what about automated responses? So some of you may know that on your Facebook profiles, if you have them, that your content is linked to the ads you see. So I have 2 daughters, and my Facebook ads are all minivans, soccer balls, and boots. So clearly I need to go shoe shopping, but they're very highly tailored. And so I think that there's opportunities to think about tailoring ads or educational messages to content like what I've shown you. Now, the trick of it is we all know also Facebook ads are oversaturated right now. There's just so many of them. But at the same time, I think that this is a campaign that is, in contrast to some public service announcements or public health campaigns, this is a pretty cheap thing to do. So Facebook ads cost somewhere, a Facebook ad campaign that's successful will run you probably about $100, and an unsuccessful campaign, which we have done, only costs about $7. Because if no one clicks it and it's a lousy campaign, you don't pay for it because no one's interacting with it. So I like this model because you pay for things that work and you don't pay for things that don't work. I think it's something to think about. Many of you know already that Facebook has an agreement with the National Suicide Hotline that if the term suicide is used on a profile, a pop-up comes up with National Suicide Hotline. Twitter and Instagram have done similar things with it. I think that's fantastic because it can reach people day or night. It can reach people with resources right in their face. I think the limitation is, as I showed you, many adolescents discuss suicide without using that specific term. So I think we could think more about ways to misspell suicide or use other terms. And I'll tell you, it's very interesting. We've been doing some work on Instagram lately, and Instagram misspelling is just the norm. It's the way that you can get into societies within Instagram that are considered more secret or more risky. Because Instagram is one of the few sites that has a policy that if you are involved in a feed that promotes self-harm, they will shut it down. So for example, on Instagram, there was a community called #self-harm, and it was shut down. It had something like, 500,000 subscribers who basically would go on Instagram, take a picture of where they had cut themselves or hurt themselves, and then post it. So Instagram has a policy of shutting these down. So they shut it down, and I think maybe the first time it took about 2 weeks, and then that community was back with #self-harm 2Ms. So that community lasted quite a while, finally was identified, finally shut down. Now we're on #self-harm 3Ms. So I think that it's interesting to think about how adolescents get around some of these rules, how they change spellings, how they change lingo. The beautiful thing about the World Wide Web is if teens are using lingo that we don't understand, there's probably a website that interprets it for us. So I think there's ways that we can try to be creative and also think about novel ways to reaching adolescents. And then I think in terms of identifying those at risk, who are people that are within an adolescent's natural Facebook environment that might be willing to undergo training or partner with some of us to be able to reach out when a concerning pattern happens. So peer leaders, I think in the college population, we've done some work with college dormitory resident advisors. And these are folks that are, as you may remember from your own experience, they're folks that are in charge of a floor of new college freshmen, very high risk population, very hard to monitor everything that happens. And so a lot of resident advisors are Facebook friending their residents and keeping a loose eye on what's going on for them. So we hear a lot of stories from resident advisors about identifying kids that are really, really homesick, or identifying where's the Friday night party going to be and how do I shut it down before it happens, or identifying kids where you are worried about self-harm. And so I think there's people out there that are using these in really creative ways. and then the cool ants. I just would love to do a cool ant intervention. And I think what's wonderful is that there's so many excellent interventions for depression out there for this population, both online and offline, that I think we could think really creatively about using this as a link to some established interventions. So I think that's where we're hoping to go and some of the things that we're thinking about. With that, I was hoping to close and leave some time for questions and be able to hear what your guys' thoughts are and what you're seeing. And I suppose I wouldn't be a social media researcher if I didn't put up the requisite link to our Facebook and Twitter. We also have a website, and I really thank you guys for your attention and would be happy to answer some questions now. Yes.
Just out of curiosity, you said that you had a kind of a failed experiment of a like. So, what went wrong, and how could it be better?
That's a great question. The question is what our failed experiment was. Some of the other work we do is identifying alcohol and substance use on social media, and our failed experiment was for alcohol prevention and education resources. So we created an ad that showed a picture of someone with a beer bottle and said, want to learn more about safety and alcohol or something like that. The first problem was we were targeting the ad to first-year college students, and so the first problem was Facebook flagged it as an alcohol advertisement for people under 21. So if you're ever in doubt about Facebook not advertising to people under 21, they're pretty rigid about it. Even when we requested the ad be reviewed, they still wouldn't put it up. So we changed the ad, and I think we made it just a college student without alcohol. And I think we ran a month-long campaign and probably got 4 clicks, so it was about $7. So we learned that this was just not the place, or it was not the right ad, or I think we thought in follow-up, we thought it was a combination of it's not really the right ad and it probably wasn't the right place. We've done some experimentation also with Facebook advertising for study recruitment. And one of the things we've learned from that for study recruitment is that in general, the populations we get who respond to an ad and sign up for studies are higher risk than the ones that we get when we go out and set up a recruitment booth or go into dorms. So they're usually higher risk. They usually have, they're more likely to have mild depression, and they're more likely to have alcohol problems. So that's been an interesting thing for us to learn when we're thinking about how do we think about who we want in a study and reaching them.
Thanks.
Sure, thank you. Other questions? Yes.
Do you have any information about who the responders are? Somebody responds to something that's on a Facebook page. Do you have any idea who that person is in relationship?
That's a great question. The question is about who responds when someone discloses. And it seems as though what we hear is that the responders kind of fall into 2 categories. One group is their close friends. So their 3 to 7 closest friends will say, hey, are you okay? Or I'm coming over. But then most people seem to have 3 to 5 good Facebook friends. So they might be people they don't even spend a lot of time with in offline life, but they're people that they do a lot of commenting to each other and a lot of liking, and sometimes the friendship is removed by distance. Sometimes it just seems to be someone that they do a lot of interacting on Facebook, but just not offline. And so some of the ways we can tell that is, it's a person that never shows up in their pictures, but they have the majority of the comments on their page. So it's interesting to think about what are the resources that either or both of those groups can offer. Yes?
Just thinking about with the amount of information you're able to glean from this, drug companies trolling to find out somebody that might have bipolar disorder, so look, tutors for you. Are they doing that now?
It's a great question. The question is whether drug companies are using the same content that we're looking at to tailor ads. I think the loose question seems to be that they're starting to be able to, and some of you have seen that Facebook in particular has really loosened the protections that you have that connects your Google searches, your Amazon purchases, and your Facebook profiles. So I think we will be seeing a lot more of those, especially if someone is posting that kind of type of content on multiple sites. So if someone Google searches, do I have bipolar, it's very likely that those dots will be connected quite quickly. Yes?
So is there a fear of on Facebook, because it is public information to a certain extent, that when the students go and apply for jobs and stuff, and having that information being available, are they more hesitant to?
That's an excellent question. How aware are adolescents and young adults of the public nature of the sites? And I think the question, the simple answer is probably not really. We have seen, I think in high schools in particular, high school students have really had it drilled into them to clean up their profiles and be very careful with their profiles. So what we're seeing for younger students is they're keeping their Facebooks pretty clean, and they're putting a lot of content under pseudonyms and other usernames on Twitter and Instagram. But something interesting happens when they get to college, we found, and that's that their Facebook profiles go from, looking very pristine to looking like college students very quickly. So that's something interesting. And then we see when they hit about junior year summer, they try to clean it all again. But at that point, they're dealing with, some of our participants tell us they have 55,000 pictures from college on Facebook.
Ooh.
And so there's just no way that they can clean everything. They also are very aware of big data. And that's one thing we've learned too, is that big data is fantastic for text. It doesn't give you context, but right now there's not a lot of big data that can handle pictures. So we see college students going and being very fastidious about cleaning their wall, but ignoring their albums. So I think that there's still a perception that Facebook is quasi-safe, safer than Twitter or Instagram. But there's also this perception that they have so much data out there. If somebody really wanted to dig, they would find it anyway. So what the heck? Let's just have fun. That's kind of what we hear. What we also hear is that we did a study recently just looking at internet safety practices, and what we heard is that college students in particular were just tired of the message. And they felt like they wanted to vet their profiles for reputation management, but they were less concerned about jobs and safety. So there was a higher burden on what sort of image am I projecting to my friends and to partners, and less of a worry about jobs. It's a great question. Other question? Yes.
Is there good evidence that for folks that post messages that have some sort of affective valence and they get responses back, that the structure of their networks change over time, and do we see people creating sort of new clusters in terms of like frequency of contact and that sort of thing, kind of around these episodes of affective disturbance or
That's a really great question. If I'm understanding you correctly, it's getting around whether the networks change depending on how people post, especially if they're posting perhaps more frequently about depression, or is their network going to change?
Yeah.
Wow, what a great question. We have less data on Facebook and what this looks like, because some of what we've seen on Facebook is people won't necessarily defriend, but they'll block content. So they'll say, oh my gosh, I'm so sick of that person's post. So they'll block them, and the person who's posting doesn't know that. So we're not hearing a lot that it's shifting social networks on Facebook. What we do see on Twitter, however, is if you use a hashtag such as depression, and you map that network, there's a lot of close ties. And so people develop these relationships where they're posting to each other. We see it a lot with eating disorder patients. So patients with anorexia will have an entire very dense network on Twitter of people they may have never even met, but there's a lot of social support happening there. So I think on Twitter we're seeing it more than we are on Facebook. Great question. Anything else? Yes.
Can you say anything about apparent influences towards health or away from health? For example, in a given cluster, like I could imagine eating disordered patients sort of becoming less helpful with the kinds of information they're exchanging versus getting more support.
That's a really great question about what the role of the parent is in helping the teen to navigate the online social network and the messages, or no?
No, I'm saying, is there any thought that behaviorally communicating with like-minded people, like other people with eating disorders.
Oh,
It's
does
going to
it-
be a positive or negative influence on social media.
I see. So whether communicating with people with like disorders is going to re-entrench or reinforce people in those behaviors.
Yeah.
From the social science standpoint, they believe definitely there's the theory of homophily, which is the idea you're going to become more like what's reflected back to you. I think there's a theory I like called media practice model, and it suggests that adolescents, even in the traditional media era of movies and TV, that adolescents seek out and consume media that's either who they are or who they want to be. So you choose media that will help teach you what you want to be. And then there's, of course, the peer influence piece. So there's a lot of theoretical suggestion that adolescents who engage in these networks and have these messages enforced, reinforced, that will further entrench people. What's interesting in the eating disorder world that we're starting to see is that there's pro-ANA Twitter feeds and there's pro-recovery Twitter feeds, and there's people that live in between. And what we wonder is whether the people who live in between are sort of trying to pull over to this side but still having trouble letting go of the other social support network. And there does seem to be, for people who are very immersed in the network, they'll call each other out by username, they'll favorite each other, they'll retweet each other, so it becomes a more bonded network than we would have thought for people who have never met. So I think that there is reinforcement. I think people get entrenched in the network, but how? So I think one thing we've thought about is how do you pull them out of the pro-ED network and put them in the pro-recovery network? All right, well, I'll hang around for a couple minutes if there's any questions I didn't get to. Oh, yes.
Are you able to look at an association between cyberbullying and depression?
That's a great question about whether we are able to look at cyberbullying and depression. We have some separate studies looking at cyberbullying. We have been doing studies looking at cyberbullying, more interacting with people in face-to-face and through interviews and surveys rather than through content analysis. And part of the reason for that is that many of the people who have been cyberbullied, one of the first things they do is delete it. And so we have done a study that showed that people who have had the experience of cyberbullying are more likely to report depression even years later. And there's other studies that certainly show that. What's interesting, we've been focusing a lot of our studies on college students because it doesn't seem like there's a lot of literature there. And we found even college students who talk about cyberbullying report a higher incidence of depression. What we haven't been able to do is figure out how to capture that on screen, because when you've been bullied, that's one of the first things you want to do is eliminate the evidence. Great question. If you can think of a way to do it, let me know. All right, well, thank you all so much for these great questions and for coming. I really appreciate it.